Thank you everybody for coming tonight. When we put this on, we weren't sure how many people we'd get, so it is great that we actually have to put up more chairs. That's a good sign for the region, the upcoming elections. My name is Mike Hogan, the Chief Administrative Officer for Kneehill County. In this context, I'm also the main admin support for Kneehill Regional Partnership. And the Kneehill Regional Partnership is a group that is putting this on tonight. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, the partnership is a committee that's composed of the 6 municipalities in the region. So we have Kneehill County, the towns of Three Hills and Trochen, and the villages of Acton, Carbon, and Linden. So the Kneehill Partnership, the Regional Partnership, is a forum where we all get together and we try and work together to find efficiencies, ways that we can deliver services together for lower costs, and put on training programs for elected officials like this. So that's what the Kneehill Regional Partnership is about. We've recently redone the terms of reference for that. And other than meetings, I think this is the first actual event that the partnership has put in place. So once again, thank you guys for coming. Just a couple of things. I think we all know where the exits are. The washrooms are out through the main lobby as well. Just as a note, you probably noticed the camera in the front. We are live streaming this, so people do have the ability to do it from home if they were able to make it in tonight. Likewise, our intent is to take a recording of that and then make it available online as well. So if you want to go back and rewatch it, or somebody else wants the opportunity to watch it, if all goes well technically, then we'll have that opportunity. So we'll do that. And I think that's the main housekeeping stuff that I'm going to bore you with at this time. So we get to the exciting part, and I'll introduce Ian McCormick. Ian is with Strategic Steps, and I'm going to let him talk about himself. But he's the third party that we brought in to deliver this session, and he's delivered similar sessions elsewhere in the province in various areas. But I'll let him tell you about himself and what he does.
Well, good evening, everybody. As I've been watching people pour in this evening, it's been really gratifying to see so many of you here. This is also the first time we've done a council candidate workshop in person. Thus far, it's all just been virtual. So it's nice to hopefully have a little bit of interaction rather than just speaking to somebody through a Zoom screen. So I'm really kind of looking forward to seeing how this all works out for us for the next little while. I did, however, forget one very important housekeeping point, and that is that the donuts and water are back. You could blame me, or maybe you just wanted to save them. I don't know. Good. Tomorrow when you took them all into the office. I've never missed an opportunity for donuts. I had no opinion on that. So we have a couple hours here together, and the goal for this is just to get you a bit of an idea about what the role of elected official is in Alberta, particularly as a local elected official. I know some of you are currently municipal councillors, and if you have things that you want to provide as context, I'm pretty very interested to hear what you have to say on that as well. I had a reference to that we have done this before. I think this is the 5th or 6th of these we have done. Most of them have been regional. We just did one a couple of weeks ago for Sturgeon County, which was a standalone. And so that's been kind of interesting too. So just a couple of notes before we really get started. If you've got a cell phone, you can just turn it to vibrate. I appreciate that. We have the room echoes a little bit, so if you could minimize the side conversations, that would be helpful too. If you have things that you want to ask, however, please ask them whenever you like. This is a session that's supposed to be at least somewhat interactive and is supposed to be for your benefit. I kind of know this stuff, and I'm quite happy to share it with you. If you hear divergent ideas, that's kind of an interesting thing that we find with this. Different people have different political backgrounds and persuasions and things that they want to do. Interested in hearing that too. And I mentioned questions, just ask them as you go. In terms of what we're going to discuss, you have the agenda, you have the package of material already in front of you, or you may have picked it up in the back, and if not, you're welcome to get it. There's just a copy of all the slides we're going to do today. There was also a handout there that I'll talk to right close to the end of our session too. So for today, however, we're going to kind of start at the top and work our way down with some of the really interesting stuff, talking about legislation and regulations and some of the ways that municipalities operate here in Alberta. But we're going to talk about the difference between governance and administration, because that is probably the key thing that we want to talk about tonight, and that is what the role of the elected official is versus what the role of council as a whole is versus what the role of the support structure from the chief administrative officer on down is too. We'll talk about some of the things that we see sometimes causing problems, pitfalls that you can see for yourselves, having whether the expectations that you have actually match the realism of the job that comes in front of you. So those are the kind of things that we're going to talk about. Plus, we're also going to talk about some of the things that maybe you want to talk about. So that's a little bit about what's happening. In terms of me, as Mike referenced, I run a company called Strategic Steps. We're a local government consulting company here in Alberta, although we just opened an office in Saskatchewan a few weeks ago too. So we work primarily across Western Canada, a little bit into the north, and sometimes we work in the States as well. Actually, last night I was doing a little bit of work in Melbourne, Australia. I was joking with some of the folks over here. I was on call with Melbourne, Australia at 6 and with Beaumont Library at 7. Thank goodness for their vagaries of Zoom and the ability of time change. When the work that we do kind of follows the election cycle for local government, whether it's Alberta or Saskatchewan, which is actually about a year ahead of us, they had their elections last November. So the things that we're doing here now, we were doing for them about a year ago. So we start with candidate orientations. Once the elections happen, we do a lot of orientations for elected officials. It's mandatory in our Bible, the Municipal Government Act, that every municipality must offer an orientation to new elected officials within 90 days of the election. So we do a lot of that. We've got 16 or 18 of those things going. And then we start into things like strategic planning as well. Once you have an idea about what it is that you want to accomplish, you have a bit of an understanding of the role, moving into what you want to do over the 4-year term is quite important to do that. And then odds and ends too, we do. If there are issues, sometimes we counsel codes of conduct. We sometimes get called into investigations into those. We just wrapped one up. Actually, we just wrapped 3 of those up actually in this year so far. So there are a few of those going around. Bylaw reviews, policy reviews, all that kind of stuff. I have a real passion for local government. I actually wrote a book about it called Who's Driving the Grader and Other Governance Questions. It's published nationally by Municipal World. And if you're interested in it, it certainly is available, and I'm more than happy to help you out with some of that stuff too. It's funny, I got the title, and those of you who are involved at all in local government will understand what the title means. It's about the role clarity between what's governance and what's administration, and how there's supposed to be 2 solitudes. My mom, who doesn't understand a lot of local governments, has no idea why I called it what I called it. That's for her. So in terms of what you want to see from this, I've told you a little bit about what we're going to cover over the next couple hours. From you, the 40 or 50 of you, however many are here, is there anything specific that you want to make sure that we cover? You're welcome to interject at any time, but I'd like to just make sure that we cover the things that you want to cover as well. Nobody? I can meet nothing. No expectations, I can meet that. Okay. So we'll start at the top then. We'll start with legislation, because we'll get that out of the way while you're still awake. When we talk about legislation, which really are the rules for local government, actually the rules for everything that happens government-wide and in a lot of cases in the public and private sector here in Canada as well. We start at the top and we work down. In Canada, there is no recognition of local government in Canada's constitution. So what that means is, so all the Constitution says is municipal government belongs to the provinces and territories. And what the provinces and territories do with it differs from coast to coast. So for example, those of you who live in Kneehill County, if you went to BC or if you went to Saskatchewan, they wouldn't know what a county is. They don't have counties. If you went to Ontario, they would have counties, but they'd be in different structure. If you watch a lot of American television, their county structure is different again. In the same way, if we went to Saskatchewan, we would talk about things like rural municipalities. If we went to BC, we would talk about things called regional districts. So they're all slightly different. And the definitions of them show up in things like our municipal acts. We call ours the Municipal Government Act, which is the MGA, which I suspect most, if not all of you know. It's the second largest, wave it around, would you? So that's the Municipal Government Act if anybody bothers to print it out and buy it. It's the second largest piece of legislation in Alberta. Does anybody want to take a guess on which one's bigger than that one? Taxes show up in this one. It's the Insurance Act. It's the only piece of legislation in Alberta that's actually bigger than the MGA. So the MGA is huge, and it represents everything that has to do with local government operations in Alberta. Now, as elected officials, you call it your Bible, but you don't need to know it cover to cover. There's some very technical pieces in there around assessment. Assessment, for example, which you would have an assessor talk about, or some of the pieces around municipal infrastructure, which you would have public works. But there is a big chunk in there about establishing municipalities, how they run, how they can change, how they can be dissolved. So the Municipal Government Act is a key piece of legislation. However, it's really just a skeleton. The MGA gives us the framework around which you must operate, things you must do or must not do. And then we'll get into how you flesh that out a little bit later. So that's one of them. The second one we deal with quite a lot, particularly now, of course, is what we call the LAEA, or Local Authorities Elections Act. So between now and October 18th or 19th, whatever election day is, those are the rules that govern elections, again, from a skeletal perspective. So it talks about who can be a candidate, how the balloting will work, who gets elected, or not who, but how people get elected, that sort of thing. But it doesn't speak specifically to things like where you're allowed to put your election signs, because that comes a little bit lower down in the priority list too. So we deal with the MGA, we deal with the LAEA, and you probably all are aware of FOIA, the Freedom of Information Protection and Privacy Act. And that has a big impact on municipalities too. Many of you will know about council meetings. Most of council meetings will be in public session where anybody can watch government being done. But sometimes councils will go behind closed doors in what's called closed session or in camera. And that's only allowed in some very narrow circumstances. It used to be just called land, labor, and legal, but that metaphor is kind of clunky. So there are a series of what's called exceptions to disclosure in FOIA. Reasons the council can close its sessions for the public, but nobody can attend except the council members and anybody else they invite. Typically, that would be senior members of administration, and it would also be whoever may be involved in the conversation if it's a contract negotiation, a human resources issue, that sort of thing.
When you have closed session, do you have time to rough number or estimate, let's say, percentage of time that would be occurring?
The question was for those people who are streaming at home, how much of the time in a council meeting will be spent in closed session? The short answer is it depends on what the issues are. The long answer is there's a principle at play here, to me anyway. The principle is, does council do its business in public unless there's a reason it can't? Or does council keep everything quiet and silent unless it absolutely has to do things in public? So the answer to your question is, if you were doing probably more than 10 or 15% of your council business in closed session, that would start I would start to ask some questions about that. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in detail a little bit later, but it is something to kind of keep an eye on. It will also change with the issues at hand. There may be something significant, a land sale, for example, or some rezoning that's going on. We have to have some discussion with legitimately in private. And so those sort of things will take a little bit more time. But if a lot of stuff is being done behind closed doors, that to me anyway, there's a red flag to that. Does that answer your question? Okay, thanks. So we dealt with the Constitution, we dealt with the Municipal Government Act, we've dealt with the Local Authorities Elections Act, and we've dealt with FOIA, but a little bit of principle around that too. Maybe kind of typical to read from that part back. Within the Municipal Government Act, Section 3 of the Act is what I consider to be kind of one of the most important. And it comes right after the definitions section in the Act. And it speaks to what the purposes of local government are. Why does it exist? I mean, fundamentally, if nobody lived in a particular geographical area, there would be no need for a local government. Fair enough to see. So this is the reason it exists. So because those people live in that geographical area, they don't want to look after all the collective interest things, the roads and sidewalks and snow clearing and stuff. So they appoint some people to do that for them. And those are the elected officials. So they're kind of minding the shop on a month-by-month or week-by-week basis, but even they don't want to do it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So they hire people to look after it on their behalf, which is where your chief administrative officer and the rest of the team comes in.
So here are the purposes of local government in Alberta. And this changed a little bit ago within the last revision of the Municipal Government Act. The first one is to talk about providing good governance to the people of a municipality. Now, good governance does in fact have a definition. It's a kind of a group of principles. I mentioned I wrote that book called Who's Driving the Greater. There's a whole section in there on good governance, but you can probably find it on the internet pretty well as well. A second one about this is to foster the well-being of the environment. Now, I don't have a definition of what environment is in this case, if it's the physical environment, or whether it's just kind of collective well-being about how we all interact with each other. But one of the jobs of local government is to do that to the best of their ability. That's one of the newer sections of this municipal purposes. It also then talks about providing services, facilities, and other things that, in the opinion of council, are necessary or desirable for all or part of the community or municipality. So this is where you're supposed to be providing stuff. This is where the aquatic center comes in. This is where road construction and grading comes in. This is where garbage pickup comes in. This is where all those things that a municipality provides are important. In here, though, is a bit of a nuance in that it says it's for the betterment of all the entire community or part of the community. Not everywhere needs roads, needs bridges and culverts, but some of the places that need them. So when you start to look at elections being at large versus, which are primarily urban elections, a division-based, which is of course in the county, then there's a little bit of a difference about who's accountable for what part of the municipality. When you take your oath of office is to the municipality as a whole. So even if you represent a particular division, you may be asked to have an opinion on something else that's going on in a completely geographically different area of your municipality. And you're supposed to do that thinking about the betterment of the municipality as a whole. Which of course may mean money gets spent in somebody else's division rather than in your division. And that can certainly start to lead to some conflict between council. The next one is to develop and maintain viable communities. So in much the same way as people move to a particular area, chose to stay there, there's a reason for that. You want your community to continue. We've seen things like the Kneehill Partnership. We've seen things like an instrument called the Intermunicipal Collaboration Framework recently that some of you may be aware of, where we start to talk about collective interest of municipalities in a region or an entire municipality rather than just in a particularly small area. So we're looking at that too now. And the newest part to this is about collaborative work. So you're supposed to be nice to your neighbors, recognizing that the rising tide floats all boats. And a vicious cycle goes the other way, and it's not any good for anybody. So this last piece was one of the most recently added pieces to the legislation in terms of purposes, why municipalities exist in Alberta. So a lot of times references to things that happen in council will be tied back to these municipal purposes. When you as council members are asked to do stuff, whether it's that providing services or the good governance or looking at the environment or collaborating and cooperating with your neighbors, you have a series of levers that you can pull, and there aren't very many of them. You kind of have these three main areas. You've got a tool called a bylaw, which sounds like it is a law, it's a rule, and there are penalties for contravening it. And it can be created within the authority of local government. We'll get to a little bit later about what that authority is. They are more onerous to create, to modify, and to remove than the other levers that you've got, and that's done on purpose, so that you think that sober second thought into it. A bylaw, for example, requires 3 readings to 3 votes to get it to pass, and usually that doesn't all happen at the same meeting. Usually you do a couple of votes, and then you take a thought about it and come back and do a 3rd vote at the next meeting. Not doesn't always work that way, but that's often the way it works. So that's probably your most powerful lever. The next lever you have is something called policy. So in as much as things like those Municipal Government Act or a bylaw will create the skeleton for you, policy helps flesh that out. The reason you want to use policy, which can be created or modified or removed with a single vote of council, is that it provides direction to your administration. So instead of your chief administrative officer going to council every few weeks and saying, how long do you want to, or how short should the grass be cut this time? How short should the grass be cut this time? How short should the grass be cut this time? We have a policy which says when the grass gets this long, cut it. Don't come and ask us again and again and again. So that saves a whole lot of time for a whole lot of people. It also means you're predictable. And you can also get things like that, which you know when you cut the grass, if you cut it longer or shorter, you have to cut it more or less. And there's a cost associated with it every time you do it. So you can tie the decision of council to cut the grass this long versus this long. So the overall cost is going to have an impact on your budget over the course of the year. So there are those kind of implications to it too. So policies are generally a little bit more minor. Not only that, but you as council will have governance policies setting the direction of the overall municipality. Your administration will have a whole bunch of administrative policies as well, which aren't yours as elected officials. You probably know that they exist, but they would certainly be of interest to your staff. CAO on them. So those are the two legislative levers. The third lever is your budget. You put money to the things which are priorities to you. Whether you have a strategic plan and a set of priorities set for council, if you fund something, it's important. If you choose not to fund it, it's not important. It's kind of black and white that way. Or you increase or you reduce funding. Now, there are some things you just have to do, right? You have to keep people paid, you have to keep the insurance paid up, you have to keep the lights on. So there are some things that you have to do year after year after year. But as an example, you may have met some of the other municipalities I've worked with have talked about the real prominence of things like pickleball. And they said, we've seen pickleball really grow. We have to start building more pickleball courts. Well, more pickleball courts cost money. And you only have $1. Where are you going to spend it? Where are you going to get that money away from? Or are you going to ask for another $1 from the people who are providing the money to you in the form of taxes? And that becomes a political choice for you as members of council. So these are your levers. You've got bylaws, you've got policies, you've got budget. The last comment on here is something called legislative paramountcy, which is just a long way of saying you can't do anything that another federal or provincial government says you can't. An example of that is term limits. Sometimes I hear councillors saying, I'm going to come into office, and one of the things I really want to do is set term limits. No councillor can be allowed to serve for more than 2 terms. However, that contradicts what's in the Canadian Constitution in terms of freedom of expression and all that kind of stuff. So you could pass that by law, but it would be of no force in effect. So just not much point doing it. So make sure you're sticking to the knitting in terms of what local government is actually allowed to do. Because if you're doing things you aren't allowed to do, it's just no force in effect. And if that piece on term limits also included something else that was within your control, saying, we're going to do term limits and you have to show up to council orientation when it happens in October or November. Well, the second part around council orientations is legit and can be within your sphere of influence. So what would happen is that bylaw or that policy would be of no force in effect in regards to the term limits, but it would still be in force in effect in regards to the piece around orientations. So that's what legislative paramountcy means. It's just a fancy way of saying you can't contradict a higher order government regulation. So we've gone from kind of the Canadian Constitution all the way down. So we have some key bylaws that you will have a look and you will see. They're usually available on municipal websites. If you look around the province, and in fact in some other provinces as well, these bylaws are fairly similar. One of the key ones here is about meeting procedure. And it sets out what you can and can't do within a council meeting. When you have to have open session, when you're allowed to go into closed session. The establishment of committees, who sits on those committees, so for example, can the mayor sit on committees? Does the mayor get to vote if he's on those committees? In some places they can, in some places they can't. For example, in the Northwest Territories, it's not common for mayors to vote, period, actually, to put on committees. The only time most mayors in the Northwest Territories vote is to break a tie. Here, of course, voting is mandatory unless there's a reason that you can't. You have to vote. In Saskatchewan, if you choose to abstain from a vote, it's just counted as a no vote. So we all handle these things a little bit differently. So your meeting procedure bylaw is usually one of your longer bylaws and can be a little bit technical. Another bylaw is your code of conduct bylaw, and this is fairly new. A lot of municipalities had codes of conduct before, but it was only in the last few years that they actually became mandatory for every municipality to have. And if you were to look at a code of conduct across the province, they're very similar. Now, what they speak to is what we expect in terms of conduct of elected officials within our municipality, what we consider to be a breach or a break of any of those pieces of unacceptable, what we consider to be unacceptable conduct. It speaks to things like gifts or inappropriate use of your authority, that sort of thing. And more recently, we have seen sanctions actually laid out. If you breach the code of conduct, these are the sanctions that you will be subject to. Now, some of them are pretty narrow, they're quite restrictive. First offense this, second offense this, third offense this. Others say council can pick from this list of things what it sees as the appropriate sanction. And it could be anything from a written reprimand or a verbal reprimand to removing a council member from committees. You can't remove a council member from council, however. Only a judge can remove, well, a person can resign, but only a judge can actually remove a sitting council member from council. So these become quite important. The next piece on here speaks about your consultation bylaw, a public participation bylaw or something like that. And these two are kind of new. This talks about how do you involve the broader public in the business of local government. You have what's called public meetings, but they're not public participation. They are allowing the public to come and watch how government happens. And so the interaction between the elected officials in a council meeting, the interaction between council members and people who are sitting and watching or the gallery shouldn't happen. There should be almost a wall between those two areas, unless there's a time on the agenda for public input or something like that. Or there considered to be a delegation to council. Those kind of things are acceptable as well. So it speaks to something called the Continuum of Engagement. At one end, what it says is, we're just going to tell people what's going on. We're going to send them a newsletter, we're going to post something on our website, they're going to find out. The other end of that continuum is public, allowing the public to make a decision and the council abiding by it. But because of the way the laws are written, council has to make the final decision, so it never goes quite that far to empowering a decision. The closest sometimes we get is in remuneration. Very few elected officials want to vote on giving themselves a pay raise. Well, they probably don't really want to give themselves a pay cut either. So sometimes they say, let's get a group of citizens together and figure out what the appropriate use or way to deal with this is. Citizens can't make a final decision, say, we're going to raise your pay by this much or reduce it by this much. But they can make a recommendation to council. The council say, we agree with that group of people. Or we don't, whatever the case may be. So that's kind of a full continuum of engagement. So you've got our laws, we've got our bylaws, and so that's kind of sets the framework for how local government works. I wanted to talk now, if I can, about the difference between governance and administration. And this is one of the really key pieces about how local government in Alberta is done well. My fundamental question when I get to speak with local elected officials, and I get a lot of calls from people who are kicking tires before an election. But my first question is, why are you here? What are you doing what you want to do? What I've seen, and during my research for my book, and working with councils across the west and into the north, is that there seems to be this continuum here as well. People are either in it for public service, that they've kind of grown up and want to get out and serve the people in their community, or they're in it for self-service. They want to be the boss and tell me what to do. Now, I very rarely see anybody at one end or the other. And I'm not convinced that people really put a lot of thought into where on this continuum do you happen to fall. But it's a really useful thing to think about in terms of why are you interested in being on council? Is it to serve the greater good or is it to serve yourself? And I've got these pieces here around the aspects of this, around the various attributes about why people would do what they do in terms of the zero-sum nature of local government versus the collective goodwill. Things like the motivation, the vision that they have for their communities, the role their ego might play in all of this. Something else I would say is I very rarely see a local elected official who's a type B personality or a wallflower. Nobody gets elected. I don't think anybody gets elected because they just want to do things exactly the same as they are. They have some sort of mandate or desire to make their community better, or change something. And so I think there has to be a role of ego. They have to believe they've got the good ideas to be able to put them forward. It doesn't mean you have to overpower a whole bunch of other people, but it does certainly have to be there for sure. The other piece to that, of course, is you have to have a pretty thick skin these days. If you look what's going on social media, or even things you'll get in emails and letters to the editor of newspapers, it's tough to be a local elected official. I do what I do, and I'm not an elected official. I can tell you guys what to do. So I applaud people who are willing to put their names forward on a ballot. There's another couple of pieces here around the role of teamwork. There's one around the role of how you seek consultation, and finding what kind of results you're looking for. too. You've all got that in front of you, so I'll just leave that with you. If you have questions about it specifically, I'm more than happy to address that. When we look at role clarity in terms of who does what, council, for all intents and purposes, is the head of the beast, head of the animal. The administration is the body of the animal. So what council is ultimately responsible for is setting a long-term vision for the community. If you don't elect it thinking, why are we getting that in the first 6 months or a year? Well, really, what's the point? You're not making your community a whole lot better. But you probably have an idea of whether it's Carbon or Three Hills or wherever it is you happen to be. You want that place to be the best it can be. You want that place to be a place to call home, that attracts people, that attracts businesses, that supports the community organizations who are there. What is that? What does Three Hills look like when it is at its most successful a generation from now? So to me, that's vision. And if any of you says it's the best place to live, work, or play, I'm going to exercise. Parksville, something posted on Twitter today, that is actually on Parksville side of Vancouver, right? The best place to live, work, and play. I do a lot of vision setting with municipalities, and I'd say that's a non-starter, because everybody does that. So if you've got a vision, the ultimate expression of success for your community, that's a great place for council to reside, because you can work towards that. You've only got 4 years, maybe you've got another 4 after that, maybe another 4 after that, but you're looking towards how you make the community the best it can be. So that's vision. You're also in charge of mission. What are you doing that's going to help us get to where we want to be? What is the set of activities or things that make a difference that gets us from where we are right now towards achieving that generational vision? And then I throw values in there too. We do a lot of work with values. Those are kind of the lens or the filter through which you make decisions. Do you believe in accountability? Do you believe in things like transparency? Do you believe in family? Do you believe in all these really good things? Pick a few of these. And then you can test the decisions the council is being asked to make against these values. Are we making decisions in association with our values? Does it help us get towards our vision? So that's kind of the head of this organization going in that direction. Then there's a handoff to your only employee, your chief administrative officer. Then that person is responsible for starting to develop policy. You actually will work with some of this governance policy and set some of those rules. Your administration at that point will interpret that policy and apply that policy so they don't have to keep coming back to you and asking how long your grass should be before they cut. So they're doing that. They're also then managing the organization and getting involved in service delivery too. They're the ones who are literally, well, maybe not them, but staff are the ones who are literally driving the video. They're the ones who ought to be doing this. But it's not a straight line between the two where near the twain shall meet. Because elected officials are often really popular, really well-known community people, you're probably getting asked about the gravel. You're probably getting asked about the hours of the aquatic center, all those sorts of things. You may not be dealing with it directly, but you are hearing about it. And in the same way, your administration is hearing about governance things that don't belong to them, but they hear them and they pass them along. And so if that machine works right, works well, you have a really well operating municipality. A lot of times it doesn't work all that well, but that really begins with understanding what the different roles are. When people come into office, or decide they're going to run for office, they often have experience working with groups of people, boards of directors, if you like. Some of you may have been involved in governance boards, a lot of you may have been involved in working boards. So working boards, I think things like 4-H or a curling club or that sort of thing, where not only are you setting the direction for the organization, you're the one selling the chocolate covered albums and raffle tickets as well. You're actually doing that work. When it comes to a governance board, like a council, you are supposed to be setting direction and then stepping back and letting the experts do the work that you have hired them to do. So there are pieces to this, like I mentioned, that the primary focus here for a working board is, as I said, is to sell those chocolate covered almonds. If your primary direction for a council or a governance board is to think about vision, mission, policy, the long-term stuff. If you're thinking about next week, that's way too close. In terms of leadership in a working board, it's often the staff who lead that. If you've got an executive director of the curling club, say, they're probably the ones who are creating the agendas for the board meetings and doing all that kind of stuff. The board members come in and follow it the way they go. In a governance board, it needs to be set by council and it needs to be set at a high level, which which is where things like strategic plans come in. And I noticed that Kneehill County strategic plan is here, and so some others of you may have those as well. And so that gives you a bit of an idea of the expression of success for council. If you think about planning, again, in that working board, it's the executive director of the curling club who's probably setting up the plans and asking the board members what they think of it. For council, well, here's an interesting piece I sometimes find. This should be council setting this direction from the very top. However, if council doesn't set a good governance direction or a thorough governance direction, I've seen many an administrator quite happily get involved in governance and start setting some of that direction because there's a vacuum. I've also seen it the other way around too, where if administration doesn't push back well enough about that line between what's administrative and what's governance, a lot of times the governors, members of council, sometimes push into that administrative stuff. They will start driving the grader. We did an investigation of council code of conduct review very recently, where literally there was a member of council who was following a grader around and measuring the depth of the grader, of the gravel after the grader had gone by, because he wasn't happy with it. He thought he could do a better job than the public works director could. Maybe he could, but that's not his job. There would be all kinds of things like, all kinds of issues associated with codes of conduct. So anyway, those are some of the big differences between what a leadership or a governance board is and what a working board is. When I think of what council's job is, you actually have a few different jobs. If you recall, we talked a bit about early on about looking at the interests of the whole municipality. You also are responsible for maintaining the administration, maintaining the accountability of the administration through the chief administrative officer, the only employee in council, the only person council as a whole can direct. So that maintaining is a sheet back and forth. It's in setting goals in your CAO's contract to say that we want you to work on some of the things that are in the strategic plan, and we're going to measure you against that at the end of the year. We look at policy development. You're developing the policies and the programs as governors. You're setting that direction for administration to follow. You're dealing with the things that are required by statute. So an example of this would be recently, again, in the last few years, when cannabis was legalized. It wasn't something that the municipality really had on their radar, but they kind of had to deal with it because the federal government had legalized it. So the statute was passed, marijuana is legal, now you got to deal with it. And I've developed this kind of theory about 4 buckets. So you come into office with an idea, you put stuff on your platform about, this is going to make Linden as good as it could possibly be. So the first thing the council has to deal with as a new council or any continuing council is whatever is left over from the last council. So that can be things like big infrastructure projects. If you're halfway through a sewer line renewal, you're not going to stop it on October the 20th just because the old council's gone. You got to keep it up. And that means there's oftentimes dollars associated with that not only committed this year, but next year, potentially as well. It starts getting to managing assets. The second thing you have to deal with is things that come from other orders of government. I made that reference to cannabis. I suspect not a lot of local councils really wanted to change their smoking bylaws or their zoning bylaws to account for where a marijuana shop could be or how far outside public buildings someone could smoke a joint. But they had to because it was handed down from another order of government. The third bucket, if you like, is crisis management. It's one that you never really want to have to deal with. But whether it's fires or whether it's floods or whether it's crops that are lost, you got to deal with it. Even things like flood roofs, where you got to put a lot of money into something you don't want to put any money into at all, because if you don't, it's going to be a bigger problem in the long run. When you talk about crisis, some of it can be really serious right now. I live in Sherwood Park. Early in this council's term, they had to deal with an explosion in the parkade of our library where somebody blew up a car. They didn't plan on having to deal with that and shut down their entire building for 6 months. But they haven't had to deal with it. So, those are the 3 buckets. The 4th bucket is the one you probably wanted to work on. You may have had something on a website or brochures or on your YouTube channel that says, when I get elected, this is the stuff that I'm going to do. And ideally, that's the stuff that changes the community from now to becoming the best that it can be. And that's the stuff you really want to work on, and I get it. But it kind of comes last in this list of, from the must-dos to what you have in terms of the nice-to-haves. There's a corollary to this. There's your platform, but you're one member of 5 or one member of a 7-person council with the same voting power as anybody else. You have to convince half of council that your idea is a good one, which is where things like strategic plans will come in. If collectively you express a will about what is good and what good we want to see, it's a lot easier to see that happen than if you just wave your flag and say, I have my thing I want to do, tell the rest of you. So those are the things in terms of what I see in terms of council's job. The role of council though, so we've talked specifically about what you want to accomplish. So you look at the entire municipality. Again, for those of you elected at large, so if you are elected, you are elected by the same group of people, particularly in smaller communities. If you're elected by the same group of people, you all represent the entire community. So looking out for the entire community probably makes sense. When you're elected rurally or in a ward-based system, urban, and there aren't very many of them, none of you here will be an urban ward-based system, you have inherent tensions between what goes on in one geographical area and what goes on in another geographical area, but you still have to think about the good of the entire community. And I recognize that can be tough sometimes. Just out of curiosity, there are only 3 urban municipalities in the province that use wards. Anybody know what they are? Edmonton, Calgary was the 3rd. This is the tribute. No, it's not Leverage. Just thinking about it, they have done it. The 3rd is actually Strathcona County, where Sherwood Park is a specialized municipality. I love local government stuff, so I throw these little things in from time to time just to keep a few of you away. So there's a municipality. Lethbridge was an interesting one because a few years ago, we were involved with some work there where they were trying to determine whether their councillor should move from being part-time to being full-time. And conflated with that was how much work is there in a smaller geographical area, a ward, versus the entire city. Well, it came to pass that they called a citizens' assembly. So they asked for a representative group of citizens for Lethbridge to come together and work through this. The citizens' assembly came back and said, no, councillors, you need to stay part-time. The reason is what you actually have to do, according to the Municipal Government Act, isn't very much. You just have to show up to council meetings and committee meetings. That's it. Everything else is voluntary. So that's not a full-time job. So anyway, Lethbridge has remained at large elections now, though I think that they're starting to consider, they've now passed that 100,000 mark. That seems to be where boards seem to make sense. Okay, we'll leave it at that. The other piece then is, so your role is to look after the entire municipality. You're supposed to avoid what's called pecuniary interest, which is just a fancy way of the Municipal Government Act saying conflict of interest that has to deal with money, so that you or your family or your employer may benefit from the decision the council might make. Don't do that, because that causes a whole lot of trouble. You need to attend council and committee meetings, so that's the mandatory part of your work. There's a piece here that says avoid informal council meetings. Anytime more than half of council gets together and talks about municipal business, it's a council meeting, whether you have called it or not. If you get together to talk about last night's hockey scores, fine. But if you get more than half of council together to talk about some zoning application, or how are we going to deal with an issue that's coming in the next council meeting, that's an inappropriately called council meeting. And those are probably referenced in your codes of conduct as things not to do. We did a code of conduct violation review for the town of Strathmore, we did Strathmore, for the town of Colehurst last year. And this is one of the issues that they had, where council members, some council members would get together in somebody's house or coffee shop before a council meeting or after a council meeting, which is fine, except they started talking about some community business and shouldn't be doing it. Sometimes you don't know unless someone tells you, but now you know. You're supposed to represent the community beyond your own borders or sometimes within it. If you have a parade, for example, you may have a town float in the parade or somebody else's parade. You may be representing your community on a trade mission. Maybe you're going to Cold Lake or Lloydminster to see if you can draw on some business for the region. That's a good use of council time. Professional development is important. I like to tell people that for those of you who are current elected officials, there's no difference fundamentally between you and me, except that you got more votes than I did. There's no degree that you have to have, there's no certification you have to maintain to be an elected official in anywhere in Alberta for that matter. But it's a good idea to learn about how the job really works. So most, if not all municipalities will have a professional development budget for councillors. Use it. There are lots of events happening, as they're starting to happen again. The Alberta Urban Municipalities Association has a conference, the Rural Municipalities of Alberta has a conference, Federation of Canadian Municipalities does, and there are all kinds of educational programs that you can take as well. So there's no end of those sort of things out there. And sometimes people like me are asked to come in and talk to council for the evening. I'm actually doing that for the city of Stratford, Ontario, where they have asked me to come and speak to council for 90 minutes once a month on governance topics. They like the book. Anyway, they asked me to talk about that. And finally, the note on here about avoidance of the same issue. If you have a burr in your saddle and you're really just mad about potholes, that's all that's on your campaign, and you're just going to fix the pothole, you're going to quiet noisy dogs or something to that effect. You get into office, that issue either gets solved in 6 months, or you realize you haven't got the support to solve it. What are you going to do for the next 3.5 years? You're either going to be really bored, you're going to be a rogue councillor just be mad at stuff, or maybe this is how you don't get a good job anymore and you resign. In which case, the municipality is now on the hook for a violation. So knowing what the job, one of the reasons we do this is to know what the job of a council member is, so that you can avoid some of those problems that might occur. When we talk about the relationship to administration, it's like this two solitudes. We use this metaphor of an hourglass. Everything above this is kind of public. It starts with the citizens, again, who chose to live in a community and have asked you as elected officials to represent them. You don't want to do that all the time, 24/7, so you hire somebody to maintain that relationship for you. That's your chief administrative officer. And below that, the chief administrative officer doesn't have the expertise in public works or recreation or social services or something. So the CAO has probably hired 1 or 2 or 3 other people to help out. Maybe it's a tax clerk, maybe it's a receptionist, maybe it's a finance person. So those people report to the chief administrative officer. They don't report to council. So if council has issues with people below the CAO, they need to go through the CAO to deal with that. They can't go around it. I suspect that most, if not all, of your codes of conduct would speak specifically to that too. As for the CAOs, the Municipal Government Act says you have to have one, and you have to evaluate it every year. So they have to have an annual performance review that says yes, we're satisfied, no, we're not. And goals for improvement, things you want to see changed, all those kind of things are completely within the purview of council. The Act says you got to have the person and you have to evaluate them. The Municipal Government Act in Alberta is, if not unique, one of the few in Canada that actually says you have to do the annual evaluation. If you don't, you're setting yourself up for trouble, because if your CAO isn't working out for some reason, you have no track record of poor behavior or not meeting expectations, you end up on the hook for a huge check for severance at the end of that as well. If they're doing really well and you're categorizing that and confirming it, you have a pretty good relationship going. My belief is that you as council want your CAO to be successful. And in turn, your CAO wants council to be successful too. You're all in essentially the same business. The last note on here is about operations. Your job, and the phrase we hear a lot is keep your nose in and your fingers out. Be interested about stuff, but know where your job ends and somebody else's job starts. If you're bothering the tax clerk, for example, you end up with that poor person in that role not really knowing who their boss is. They're directly accountable to the CAO, but a member of council comes and sits in their office. How do they say no to that person? So just be careful about staying out of micromanagement. I mean, this role clarity piece is perhaps the most important one for local government to understand. In terms of the structure, this is what we consider to be governance. This is the elected officials, mayor and Reid, the rest of members of council, and the CAO, who's been hired to carry out the will of that group. When we look at the other group, that's administration, everybody else, from the CAO on down. Everybody in the municipal structure ultimately reports to the CAO reports to council. And you don't work around that. So we have what's called the one employee model of local government. When I work in the States, sometimes they have a 2-employee model. And so the CAO or city manager is accountable to council, but so is the city solicitor. And I think it's really kind of interesting that the two people, one is the lawyer, the boss who supports the council. They also have something called a strong mayor system. We have something called a weak mayor system. We can get into that later if you're really interested. We looked at some of the hazards that you see in terms of problems that can occur with lack of understanding here. So, and I referenced some of these already. Council is an entity. Council is not a bunch of people, or it's one thing. And only that thing can actually direct your CAO. So an individual member of council can't go to the CAO and say, do this, don't do that, I want you to be here, I want you to be there. Council has to do that direction, and they have to do it through a resolution. It has to, which is an agreement of council to do something. It might be a policy, it might just be a vote of council that says, go talk to the neighboring municipality about something. So that's important to know. The other is the council can't direct any staff. It can direct the council as a whole, can direct the CAO. Council cannot direct the director of public works, can't direct the lifeguard, can't direct contractors, can't direct anybody else. Be interested in what's going on, keep your nose in and your fingers out. Be aware of what's going in, but if there are questions, those need to go through the CAO. The CAO themselves, if the CAO isn't aware of what council members are doing, the CAO isn't able to direct staff well, and this is that time where we start running into staff members who don't really know what the boss is, who the boss is. Whenever we do something that's called a municipal inspection for the province and the municipality that's not going well, or a code of conduct review, we'll always go and interview a bunch of people. And this is one of the things we often find, that there's a circumvention of the way that things are supposed to work. And they're built in a particular way that they work well, and they've been tested over time. If things aren't working well, your opportunity to shake up is the only opportunity for council to change things is to speak to your CAO or replace your CAO. So if those are the problems, these are some of the things you can do about it. If administration acts on policy, that gives you a pretty good legs up. Legislative resolution, I think we've already mentioned as well. You as council hold each other in check. Whether you're a mayor or a reeve or a councillor, your vote matters the same as anybody else's vote. You have a single vote. That's why we call our system the weak mayor system. They have no more voting authority. Now I do understand they have other authority that's not, they have like a moral authority or a senior leadership authority or titular authority of mayor or reeve, but they don't have any more voting power. Then our final note here is respectful challenge. But you've got the ideas in the room a lot of the time. You just need to push back and forth a little bit. And if it's done respectfully, I think there's some real advantages to making that work. But that requires goodwill and it requires trust. Trust can be earned and can be quickly lost. So that's one of those pieces about the ongoing professional development, the collegial nature of the 5 or 7 people who are on council councils. I'm looking at the clock here, we're probably about halfway through. Does anybody need a break? Do you want to grab a donut or wash, or do you want to keep on going? Nobody's running away, so I'm going to keep going. If you need a donut, if Mike has eaten all. If you need a donut or a glass of water or wash or anything, I don't know, if you talk to your mom, go right ahead. I'm just going to keep going with expectations. So with council here, we start at the top. The councilors, you are looking at what we want to do in terms of setting a vision for your community, and you need to keep checking on that. So you're looking at vision, which is where we're going, which is mission, which is how we're going to get there, and the values, the lens that you're going to make decisions through. It's useful to have this front of mind regularly, or else you'll end up far too far in the weeds. I've seen council meetings that last 6, 7, 8 hours regularly. I kind of wonder, by the time you've reached that 6, 7, 8 hour, how are you making good decisions? I don't know how you really can. But if your council meetings are running 2, 2.5, 3 hours, it's much more reasonable if you're focused on governance. Part of this becomes cultural. The last council's meeting went 6 hours, ours goes 6 hours, that's probably fine. The last council's meeting went 8 hours, ours go 8, that's probably fine. It's not that if you're living a bit of an unexamined life, I would suggest that you have a look at why you're dealing with some of the things that you're dealing with. If you're having really long meetings, are you getting too far down into the weeds? So you're looking at vision, you're looking at mission, you're looking at values. Then you're talking about your plan that you've got. That's your strategic plan. The goals that you want to accomplish between now and the end of your term, or however long you're with council. The strategies that you develop, the things that you're actually going to do. So goals talk about change over time. What's different 4 years from now than it is right now? So a goal might be, and one that commonly occurs, and it would be the internal workings, is to be an open and accountable local government. That sounds like a lot of a goal. And then within that, you have a series of strategies, things that you're going to do to make sure you get from where we are now to being that open and accountable local government. And that might mean things like doing this, like webcasting or broadcasting meetings. It might mean using less and less in-camera time. It might mean taking council or committees on the road, meet people where they are. What's to stop you from having a council meeting in high school so that grade 6 students can see how government works? And so those sorts of things, really actions that get you towards being that open and transparent government. And the bottom end of that is then performance measures. How do you know if we're actually doing what we wanted to do? And you can check on those on a fairly regular basis, an annual basis, maybe on some of your high priority stuff on a quarterly basis, or maybe 3 times a year. So in terms of the plans that you've got, your plans as elected officials are to develop the vision and mission and the strategic plan. Then there's a handoff. So those are your plans. Those are the things that you can hold your CAO accountable for. Those are the things that you can talk to your residents about, things that you want to accomplish and have accomplished. Then there's that transition over to administration. The administration probably has an idea about how they're going to implement some of the things that you want to see done. I heard a former deputy minister tell me once, what interests the minister fascinates the hell out of me. The same thing should work in local government. What interests council should fascinate the CAO, and it should work on down as well. So if council has said, we want to be an open and transparent local government, then the CAO is probably going to be working quite hard on that. And that's what shows up in things like operational plans and business plans. Along with a whole lot of other stuff that person has to do too. He's got to manage his human resources. He's probably got to set long-term capital plans or replacement plans. He's got to do some of these other things too, or HR or IT, or any of these sorts of things. So those are plans that you probably want to know exist, but they aren't plans that belong to the elected officials. It's just due diligence to make sure those things are actually there. And then further down is the actual delivery. Municipalities exist for a reason. They're to do stuff for the people who live in the region, whether that's putting on social service programs, whether that's supporting the arts community, whether that's making sure roads are in good repair, or all of those things. That's why you exist. Then finally, at the bottom there is reporting. Checking out on a quarterly basis or an annual basis how well we're doing in achieving all the things we want to do. And I put a note in here too on the side about budget, because that's where your priorities are. You're putting your money where your priorities are. And you can check back against that. One of the council's jobs is to hire the auditor for the municipality. It's not the CAO's auditor, it's council's auditor. So your job is to hire that auditor and then receive the auditor's report. And the auditor will tell you whether the financial statements are correctly stated, if there are anything that you might want to look at, or some processes that you might want to change. But that's one of the council's jobs, is to check up on things. To have a successful term of office, a bit of a recap on a bunch of these things, is to be visionary. If you're just thinking about what's happening a week next Thursday, that's too near. If you're thinking about what's happening next year, that maybe even still be too near. What you want to think is how you can make the community the best that it can possibly be over the long term, then bite off a smaller chunk of that. So how are we going to be successful in a generation, but what are we going to do over the next 4 years to help ourselves get there? Strong policy, I think there's a correlation between having strong and regularly reviewed policy and elected council meetings. If you are being predictable, and if administration doesn't have to keep coming back and asking you the same questions or nuances on those questions, you can actually get through the business quite a lot faster, as long as you trust as long as that trust then between the elected officials and administration as well. So policy is really important. I could say bylaws here as well. Another piece to this is the review of policy. All the bylaws and all the policies remain in effect until council removes them. So as an example, we were doing a review of a town of probably 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 people, and we were looking at their bylaws and their policies. They had a bylaw that referred to hitching horses on Main Street, not York Main Street, a different Main Street. Which, I mean, no harm, no foul. Probably nobody had hitched a horse on Main Street for 20, 30, or 40 years. Not a big deal, except that I said, well, if they still have this on the books, what else is there that's still on the books that they don't really know about? So with not having examined some of those policies or some of those bylaws and remove the ones that you don't need anymore, whether they're harmful or not, how do we really know that you're living that examined life? So one of your jobs is not only to create policy and modify it, but just go through it. And sometimes it's quite a lot of it, it'll take a full term to get through the whole lot of it, but you can certainly attempt to do that. Being a team player, because everybody's vote counts exactly the same as anybody else's, there's no party platform, there are no whipped votes. You need one more than half of council to support your idea, or at least half of council plus you to support your idea to make anything happen. So sometimes there's horse trading that goes back and forth. But Being a team player now and helping somebody else will probably help you in the long run. As long as all those ideas are still aligned to achieving the ultimate vision of your success for the community. Communication is important both within council and between council and administration and between council and the population. So some people will, there's that metaphor about meeting people where they are. Sometimes that is physical. Sometimes I hear about the mayor going to have coffee down with the Senate at A&W on Tuesday morning or whatever the equivalent is, or participating in a Facebook group. Sometimes it's less literal than that. Maybe it's going to talk to those grade 6 kids to bring them up into what governance means for their community. Maybe it's putting out a newsletter. Maybe it's having a table at Canada Day celebrations or something to that effect. Or even putting on something like this around communications. Building bridges is just a bit of an adjunct to communication, that we're stronger together in all of this. And finally, know that the buck stops with you. You were elected by the people of the community. If things are going great, feel free to accept the accolades. But if things aren't going well and it's something you did or didn't do, then the buck has to stop with you. An apology can go a long way. Fixing things can go a long way. Passing the buck and passing the blame to somebody else doesn't go very far. So just some things to know in terms of success, in terms of office. When I think about what you do as elected officials, so I have my bucket stacked on my board, I've got my hat stacked. So these are some of the things that I see that you as elected officials end up doing, both maybe those now or through the course of your term. You're there because you're community builders. You've been there probably since the beginning. You probably were involved in some other community group or a faith group or a sport group or an arts group or something to that effect. And you've kind of taken the next step. So you've got that group of people around you already. You're kind of doing something different with it. You're a direction setter. If we talk about strategy and planning and vision already, if you have a pretty good idea of a compelling vision for the success of the community in the long run, you can probably get people to buy into that. That'll really help grow your community. You're a meeting participant. The Municipal Government Act says thou shalt attend council meetings, and if you don't, if you miss too many council meetings, your seat is declared vacant. You're asked to resign, somebody else who wants the job will come in and do it. You're a member of a council. Your power is in the group. So you are one of 5 or one of 7. In some places in Alberta, in fact, councils are 3, which is really tough if somebody's missing. So you see, it's much easier to find a mayor and a deputy mayor than number them. And finally, you're a regional rep. So Mike introduced this as the regional partnership. And so you've come together to do things like this. My hope is that it would be after the election that there are more organizations like this, there are more things that this regional partnership puts on, being stronger together. So that's the good stuff. There are some things that don't go terribly well too. And a lot of it is based on, do you understand the role that you actually got yourself into? So there are some things here about what you do, what you can't do. The first being, have you picked off an issue that, are you worried about something you can actually do something about? If you are concerned about term limits, for example, and exercised about that, get yourself elected to deal with term limits, but you realize quickly that you can't actually do anything about it because you're going to open yourself up to a constitutional challenge, and that's just going to be a real headache. So if you can't do it, how are you going to spend the rest of your term? The other piece to that then is, have you identified what the real issue is, or just a symptom of something else? And if you're just attacking the symptoms, you're not going to get to deal with the core of the issue, and that's going to cause you some problems in the long run too. The one issue candidate, or the I'm mad about something, I think we've already talked about, that's the person who comes into office that either figures out 6 months in that they've got a resolution to their topic, or they can't get a resolution to their topic. They don't know what they're going to do for the next 3.5 years. But worse than that, the rest of the council probably doesn't know what they're going to do. Maybe the municipal administration doesn't either. If you're looking at building a team, so you've got, as mayor, have the same power as anybody else. One of the things we often suggest is doing some sort of style analysis, a personality analysis, to understand each other as humans as you begin to form a team together. There's a metaphor, there's a process around forming team dynamics, team building. It's called forming, storming, warming, performing. Some of you may have heard of it. But if you don't understand what pushes each other's buttons, for good or for evil, it's hard to really understand why people do what they do. So understanding people as people becomes really important. We did a strategic planning session for the municipal district of Preview a few years ago. And during the evening, they decided it was the team building, so they all just took themselves off to the shooting range. That was team building. Mike, that makes sense? Okay, so they're knowing each other as a team. And then respecting roles, understanding what your role and your role is. You can't be everything to everybody all the time right now. So you have your jobs to do as elected officials. Administration has their jobs to do as administration. The public, if you like, has their jobs to do too. If you try and do everybody's job, you're not going to do any of them very well. So know where it is. If you really want to be the director of public works, go be the director of public works. Don't interfere as an elected official with the job of the director of public works. So that's some of the role clarity piece. If we look at some of the landmines, the places that are going to cause you problems, there's just a list of stuff here that we've kind of dealt with a lot of this already. And if I look at it, we've talked about the role of council needs to lead. You are being asked to make executive decisions. You hire people to make management and operational decisions for you. If you don't have a good relationship with your CAO, that gets worse over time. Those typically don't prepare themselves. And there are two pieces to the CAO council relationship, particularly for a new council. The CAO is probably a carryover, has maybe been there for 1 term, 2 terms, 3 terms. But fit the council at the time when the council hired that particular person. Had the skills, had the aptitudes, had the fit, blended well with council, they understood each other. The further you get into the future, now that CAO is maybe not as council's person, still has those same skills and aptitudes, but maybe the fit is a little bit different now. That CAO doesn't fit the 5 or 7 people who've been elected to council anymore. So what are you going to do about it? First of all, you need to understand that that's a question of fit rather than skill. There's many a CAO in Alberta who's found themselves out of a job. I'll use an example actually. There was a CAO in Sturgeon County, just north of Edmonton, who won an award as CAO of the Year for the Rural Municipalities of Alberta. The election came that October. He was out of a job within a month or 2 after the election. So he just won the CAO of the Year award, and he was out looking for work. So it had nothing to do with his skills. He just didn't fit that council, and that's the only person the council has. So lack of community consensus building shows up here. The role of boards and committees. So council is the decision-making body. You can create committees to help with some of the work, but those committees can't have oversight of an operational area. So for example, you can't have a council public works committee to which the public works director reports. You could have like a recreation advisory committee, which is just maybe half council and half members of the public that are just generating some ideas. You're building up the next generation of elected officials through your public input. And you're just asking people for their information, but they have no ability to make a decision. They just make recommendations. So those are kind of okay. And those kind of relationships are set out typically in your meeting procedure file about what types of things committees can do. Overreacting. So sober second thought. Sometimes you probably know that you end up with a hot topic and sometimes you react poorly the first time out. So taking a little bit of time to think about something. Government wheels tend not to move particularly quickly. They move faster in the local government realm than they do in federal or provincial government, but it's very rare that a decision must be required right now. We often think about it. That's one of the reasons that bylaws, for example, take 3 readings. If you really want to make this decision, so let's think about it for the next week or so between now and our next meeting. But if you still think it's a good idea, we'll vote for it then again, but we don't want anybody to be overreacting. The misuse of confidentiality, we're going to talk a little bit later in terms of pecuniary interest and what should be in closed session that is no longer in closed session. Misuse of position, we're going to talk a little bit about that in terms of the pitfalls that you will see about ethical violations. We do a full session, conference sessions on municipal government ethics. And so ethical violations around misuse of position show quite a lot there. Playing favoritism, if you've got a favorite person on staff, or you perceive that way, that could be relationships. And then family ties and influences, particularly in smaller communities, where it's not uncommon for an elected official to have a family member, maybe a distant family member working in the municipality. And there may not be favoritism that shows up there, but it could just be perceived that way, and that tends to go poorly. Usually the codes of conduct or something in ethics will say nobody can supervise a direct, like a direct family member, a first order family member. But if you had a person, if you as an elected official had somebody who worked it's probably not a big deal, as long as they are working within the policy framework there. And that you as a member of council aren't seen to be playing favorites and are just abiding by the policy. One of the pitfalls, the last slide we could have said, is just social media. And so we do a bigger presentation on this too. And I said for better and for worse is the subtitle on this. Social media is, to me anyway, the definition of community has changed over time. We used to just think of community as purely geographical, me and my neighbors, of course, across the street. That was our community. As connectivity has grown and transportation costs have reduced, and the ease of getting around has changed, community has changed now to more interest-based communities. So it may be, maybe my wife's book club, which is just a good one. But it might be that, it might be your church group, it might be a school group, it might be somebody who's interested in medical work. So those are the kind of interest groups that we would see in terms of definition of community. The communication for those has become greater and greater as the tools have become easier and easier to access. Tonight, for example, we're streaming on YouTube. If we look at things like Facebook, pretty much every community now has a Facebook rant and rave site that says, very rarely is that about giving their local elected officials kudos for doing a great job. In the same way, sometimes, I made a reference earlier to the Senate that meets at A&W on Tuesday afternoons. It's just the group of old guys that hang around and talk about common sense and things like that. That's a community as well. And as we start to talk